Books before print. This video provides a summary and some of my notes on Howard Chapter 1. With this guide as a starting point, I encourage you to read Chapter 2 on your own and make some notes to help you prepare to write assignment number 2. So Howard writes, "No other technology in human history has had the impact of this invention. Indeed, the book is the one technology that has made all the others possible, by recording information and ideas indefinitely in a convenient and readily accessible place." She goes on to say that by examining the book as a technology, we get the best example of how profoundly information and media technology affect culture and history, and how vital the technology of the book has been to cultural and intellectual change. These two quotations from Howard's introduction present the crux of her argument about the value of studying books as a kind of technology. With this argument in mind, let's turn to Chapter 1. From antiquity, meaning about 800 BCE, to the European Renaissance, roughly beginning in the 1300s, 14th century, the early history of books is necessarily a history of the transmission and adoption of an array of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese techniques for recording information and images. Many early books looked very different: clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and so forth. But they were used for similar reasons as books. They were read aloud, collected, loaned by libraries, used in university classrooms, given as gifts, and sold in bookstores. One of the most famous libraries in history was in Alexandria, Egypt, known for having the most extensive collection of literary and scholarly texts in the ancient world, most in the form of papyrus scrolls. Sadly, the Library of Alexandria was burned in 48 BCE when Julius Caesar set fire to his own ships during a battle in the harbor, and the fire spread to nearby docks and then to the library itself. That story is itself debated. Some people say that the library didn't really burn, that it was actually budget cuts that doomed it. But either way, the result was that the Library of Alexandria went into disarray, and many ancient works were lost forever. But many were preserved thanks to lots of scholars and scribes who had copied out by hand their own private editions. Books have long served a dual purpose as physical objects and as preservers and conduits of information. In order for writing to be preserved, it has to be inscribed on some kind of surface. For centuries, the most common writing surfaces were papyrus, made from a reedy plant that grew along the banks of the Nile River, and parchment made from animal skins. Papyrus was limited by the fact that it grew only in a narrow geographical area along the Nile in Egypt, in the Delta, and parchment was more widely available, but it was time-consuming and very expensive to produce. So the technology of paper is one of the most critical developments in the evolution of the modern book. You could, in fact, spend this entire course focusing on a study of the history of papermaking. As Howard chronicles, paper made from silk was first used in China in the 1st century BCE. Silk was very expensive, so other alternatives were tried, including hemp, and finally a kind of pulp using bark and scraps of rags was developed. So historically, paper takes an interesting route, as depicted in this map, from China to the Arab Empire to the Mediterranean by way of the Silk Road. Islamic culture and the Umayyad dynasty were especially important for the spread of papermaking. As Howard writes, the spread of Muslim culture and values is especially important in the history of books. Baghdad was at one point the center of the intellectual world. So paper is one of the foundations of the book's core technologies. Another core technology is the format itself, known as the codex. Now, for many centuries, the primary format was the scroll, a single long roll of papyrus or parchment that was read by spooling from one end to the other. Of course, we still use the term scrolling when referring to web pages in a rather interesting historical holdover in our language. Scrolls are pretty good for storing text, but retrieval is a bit harder. To get to a particular location in a text, you might have to unroll many feet of papyrus. Moving from one section to another was not easy. The Romans later had developed something called a diptych, made from two panels of wood, or in the case of this example on the screen, ivory, that were held together with some kind of a hinge in the middle. This two-panel system was extended into a longer codex form by adding more panels, or pages. The codex became popular among Christian monks and missionaries, mostly because of its portability and ease of use. It was much easier to flip pages to find a passage than to unroll feet of papyrus on a scroll. So we went from the two panels to multiple panels, and from the scroll to the codex, which is the same format as what books are that we know them today. Pages bound together along a spine. Now, one of the key surprises, I think, in the early history of the book is that books existed for many centuries before the invention of the printing press. Now, think about what that means. Entire libraries of texts were copied out by hand. Now, Howard has a wonderful section in her chapter 1 called Making a Medieval Book, pages 12 to 15, and she describes the laborious process used to make books prior to the invention of the printing press. Several things are notable here. First is that there was a robust textbook market long before the printing press. Bookstores popped up near the universities in cities like Paris as early as the 12th and 13th centuries. Now remember, the printing press doesn't come along until 1450, 200 years later. Students could pay to borrow a master copy text from which they would copy out by hand sections or passages. Secondly, another notable thing about the early history of the book and the making of the medieval book is that the primary production sites for bookmaking were monasteries. Scribes, like this fellow here, worked in locations called scriptoria or scriptorium, which were attached usually to monasteries, where they would copy out religious and scholarly texts. Scribes developed very elegant letter forms, and the first typefaces actually replicated these letter forms. Now, this is a trend that we'll see over and over again in the technology of the book. Every time there's a new invention, like the printing press, it imitates the old. So metal typefaces were originally designed and made to look like hand-lettered script. Why? Because that's what was most familiar to readers. So Gutenberg's first typefaces were designed to look like they were written by hand. So the initial centers of book production, at least in Europe, were basically attached to universities and monasteries. It is not surprising, then, that most of the books that got produced and circulated were classical scholarly texts like Plato and Socrates, and religious texts like Bibles and prayer books. The location of the making of books, it turns out, has a direct connection to the type of book being produced. Most early book publishing was not based in writing new stories or advancing new knowledge, but in preserving and copying knowledge from the past. So Howard also discusses readers and who was reading during this time period, and in the European Middle Ages, readership was almost microscopically small. Most people were not taught to read prior to the development of printing. Books were too expensive and were to be found mostly in the homes of wealthy landowners and in churches and religious sites. But as this image, this is Leonardo da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man, as this image suggests, this all begins to change with the eve of the Renaissance. So the last section of chapter 1 in Howard is called The Eve of the Renaissance, and it describes how the intellectual landscape of Europe was beginning to change around the 14th century. Howard says, with its roots in 14th century Italy, the cultural and intellectual rebirth known as the Renaissance pulled Europe away from many medieval traditions. In a complex way, the Renaissance affected people's values, their views of the world, and the kinds of knowledge they sought. At the center of this change was an ideology known as humanism, the notion that man should seek out and embrace new knowledge, and this knowledge could and should be excavated from the classical past. So I've chosen Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man as perhaps the iconic image of Renaissance humanism. Hence the name, and most of you know this if you've taken Western Civ and history courses, the name Renaissance actually literally means rebirth, suggesting the idea of a rebirth of classical Greek and Roman philosophy, literature, and science. Now, this rebirth or Renaissance or interest in this new form of humanistic scholarship and the move away from the medieval religious world was very, very important for the history of the book. Because the book needs not only a technology for production, the printing press, But the book also needs an appetite for consumption. There is no reason to mass produce something if nobody needs it. But by the middle of the 15th century, as Howard chronicles, Europe was ripe for the innovation that would make books more widely available. And the story of that innovation is covered in Chapter 2.